Hey reader, this is Centaur here. Today we have a bit of a different video. We're going to talk about one of the optional rules in the back of the 3rd edition core rulebook, which deals with combat jump and gliders. Okay, now I'm doing this because in a couple days I'm going to be headed over to Maryland to participate in a narrative event where I will be running an airborne unit that uses these rules. And so I figured it was kind of fun as I was getting to learn it to kind of talk through a little bit of the tactical usage for airborne deployed troops and how to use these optional rules effectively in case you end up using them in a casual game or you run into them and are able to use them at a tournament or something like that. Okay, so to start off with, this is going to be a fight in, as you can see, kind of a Western European farm village. This is actually going to be the last time you're going to be seeing this board for a little while because I'm going to be circulating it out for my next set of demo games. And so I figured I'd just do one last one over here. And so we ended up getting started off with the Germans deploying their troops. And this is at the start, or actually near the middle-ish because of the number of dice that have come out, of turn 2. Okay, but to give you an idea of what is being run, we've got a machine gun team, a mortar team, Howling Cow, an officer, you can see over there, and another mortar team on this far side. The mortars and the Howling Cow are within 6 inches of the officer, and the intention is that those will probably be his snap 2 targets if he needs to. So a very nicely coordinated barrage coming from that side. There is a spotter for one of the regular medium mortars over here, mostly just for keeping a better line out on what's going on over here, but I suspect he's going to be used for the other Howling Cow for firing into the opposite quarter, effectively. And so that's what he's there for. So these mortars are more designed for a direct line of sight as opposed to being used with a spotter. Okay, as you swing across, we have a Panzerschreck team that on turn 1 did a run action straight into the compound to kind of get into position behind these large hay bales. We also had on turn 1 a 6-man veteran submachine gun squad. So they all have submachine guns that are positioned there, and behind them, backing them up, is a Panzer II, who on this turn had to activate and was set on ambush. Because they know that the airborne paratroopers and the glider are possibly going to arrive. There's enough rolls for the glider. It probably will arrive. And so they end up, he's decided, hey, you know what? On first turn, I moved up into this area because of pivots, wasn't really able to get any further, really, and didn't want to move too far up. He wanted to make sure at least half of him was in cover in case bad things happen on future turns. And so he's kind of hanging out over there. And then we have a second Panzer II that's just kind of cruising. He poked around here and decided to go on ambush instead of moving up because, again, there was nobody to shoot at. This officer section with his assault rifles and then a 7-man veteran section with assault rifles they have not been given orders yet. So that's something that we'll need to consider when it comes to dropping in our boys. And then we've got the final officer over here on this side, and he's got a light machine gun team, another light machine gun double light machine gun regular here Grenadier squad. Veteran here. I think this is a veteran Grenadier squad. I think we went full veterans pretty much on this side. And then we've got another double LMG veteran Grenadier squad and the other Howling Cow. And there's the other mortars guy. So toward that end, that's kind of what they're up against. Okay, so now comes point number 1 that we need to know about the rules. Okay, and that is that the units that are being held for combat jump or being deployed with a glider are held in reserve. So they aren't going to come on the first turn. You can't obviously deploy them with the parachutes on the first turn. They have to come in from the second turn and onward. Okay, it is not an outflanking maneuver. So toward that end, you don't have to wait until turn 3. This is why they're coming in on turn 2. When they come in, they're going to arrive from reserve just like any other unit. So we're going to take 2 dice. We're going to issue them an order test, and they're going to come on. Now, I'm intentionally playing Americans at this event because the Americans, unlike the British, have a special rule that indicates that they don't suffer the -1 for coming in from reserve. So bringing in paratroopers, bringing in people on a glider is slightly more easy to do. And so in this case, we'll start our example off with a veteran 7-man U.S. airborne paratrooper section. It has 6 men with rifles, and the NCO has a submachine gun. Okay, so 7 men, nice and easy. We roll our order test. We're looking for a 10 or lower, and we've got it on a 7. Okay, So now that we've got it, instead of coming in from a point along our deployment zone edge, instead, we're going to take the order dice and we're going to place the order dice on the table pretty much anywhere, okay? Although there is some tactical usage as to where you should put it. And we're going to point it so that the arrow at the top of the rally is pointing in the direction that they're going to deploy in a long line, okay? So toward that end, what's going to happen is you're going to place it. I'm going to place it, for our example purposes, right here. And once we've placed it, the opponent gets a chance to pivot it to 45 degrees, okay, either clockwise or anti-clockwise. I always grew up, because I'm an American, I grew up calling it counterclockwise, but anti-clockwise kind of sounds kind of cool. It makes it almost sounds like there's a war going on the sides of the clock, which is kind of cool. The important thing to note about this is because you're then going to be rolling another 2d6 to see where it scatters to, you don't want to place it too close to the edge, because if it scatters so that it goes off the table edge, instead of coming on, they're going to go back into reserves, and you have to roll for them again on a future turn, which is just problematic, because we've already given up turn 1 with these guys. I don't want to give up too many more turns. So I would recommend, and again, remember, don't pre-measure this, because you're not allowed to. You don't want to go within 12 inches of the edge of the board. Now, eyeballing it, that's probably at least 14 inches. And so because of that, I'm like, okay, I feel confident about placing it roughly right about there. You also want to make sure that you don't land it such your men are going to land in impassable terrain. Now, impassable terrain is relatively rare, all things considered, but, you know, really sheer mountain, cliff, really, really deep water, things like that. Basically, if the paratrooper falls into that, he's not going to make it after disentangling himself, if he can even disentangle himself from the parachute. Okay. There's nothing that says if they land in rough terrain that that's a problem. There's nothing that even says that if it lands on a building or in a ruin that that's a problem. A person can, in fact, land in those, I suppose, because they only mention impassable terrain. So in this case, we can go pretty much anywhere on the board, as the river is considered to be more shallow water, so infantry can advance across it. It's just a problem for non-amphibious vehicles. And in this case, we're going to place it like that. The opponent, thinking ahead, doesn't want these guys quite as close to his indirect fire units. And the ambush guy being a fixed weapon, he's going to be out of arc. So it's not really going to matter in terms of where they land that way. And then we would roll 2d6. In this case, we get the full 12. And we would measure an additional 12 beyond that. And now movie magic, we've switched to the other side of the table because I felt like it would be way easier if I switched sides to do this one. We're going to measure out 12 inches. And it scatters that far, moves up to 12. And now here's how deployment works for the guys. You're going to take whoever the NCO is, whoever the leader is, and you're going to place them behind the dice. Okay? And then moving forward, 1 inch apart, we're going to form them into a line, okay? Nice and simple. So, in this case, we would measure out 1 inch, place the next guy. Oops, knock the guy. It's very important. And then movie magic, and moving a couple pigs later, we have our line. 7 guys, all in range. Now, here's what's interesting. The rules don't say what happens if... it does mention what happens if the dice scatters off the table. It doesn't say what happens if units go off the table. So if you had a full, 10, 12 dudes in the squad, I don't know what would happen, to be honest. I would probably just say, place them along the edge because, it's still in unit cohesion, right? Something like that. Because technically, the rules specifically state that if the dice goes off, then the unit doesn't arrive. I don't think the rule would be if the unit can't fit. In this case, then the unit doesn't arrive. It also indicates that, units are considered as casualties and they're lost if they go into impassable terrain, but it doesn't say anything about going off the table edge. So personally, and maybe this is because I'm just really nice, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't say that you lose them all, okay? Especially because of how finicky that 2d6 roll can be. But in this case, it didn't come up, so huzzah, we didn't have to worry about that. And then when you're done placing the guys, they're set on a rally order, which is why I've been showing the rally sign, okay? So they can't go down as a reaction to stuff, and once they're being placed, I think technically this does count as a move. It counts as a move onto the board. So if a unit had the ambush property, like this Panzer II does, and like this Panzer II does, I think they would be able to shoot at you at quote unquote any point along your move or at the end of it. So I think that that's how that would work. So just keep in mind that's a dangerous thing. You'll want to keep that as a potential precaution against any potential combat jumps that you end up doing. Again, like we are assuming competence on behalf of the opponent. This is always a good idea when you're playing any war game. Always assume competence from them. And so this opponent has wisely decided that they're close range submachine gun style units and assault rifles they just are going to put to the end of the battle order along with their indirect fire units just to see where the enemy comes in and whether they'll get in a shot. But all of those static fire units, the machine guns, autocannons on tanks, light machine gun teams, all of those are going to have ambush orders because they're waiting for the paratroopers. Okay, so this would be the first one, and that's how you do combat jump with paratroopers. Okay, now gliders are very similar, okay, but not exactly the same. We're going to go ahead and switch over to the other side of the table and grab the glider for you. Now, it's worth noting, actually, since I'm thinking about it here, before we move on, there is technically a second way to deploy paratroopers when they're coming in. And this is mentioned in the book as a potential alternative because it's slightly faster to resolve, and it involves only the order dice. There's no scatter roll. And the way this works, and honestly, I think this is actually quite brilliant, is that you choose a spot like you normally would. So, still following the same rules as normal, right? They have to roll an order test. They have to pass the order test. And then instead of coming in from their DZE, you choose a point. So we'll just say that it's this point. And, I'll point in whatever direction. The truth is the direction doesn't actually matter for this one. And we aren't going to be rolling any 2d6 in order to scatter it. My opponent won't be changing anything because instead what you do is you pick up your order dice, hold it about 2 feet off the table. Also, rip Centaur's really, really messy workbench. And then you're just going to drop it. And wherever it lands is where they go. And whatever direction the arrow's pointing in is where they're going to go. And so in this case, you definitely would have been better off, considering this is your deployment zone, you would have been better off just moving them onto the board. But in this case, the same rule would apply, right? We would set this thing to rally, wherever rally is, deploy your guy over here, and then the rest of them go out in a 1-inch line this way, okay? Honestly, I actually kind of like the dropping method, honestly. Like, the 2d6 roll is fine. The opponent getting to move stuff is kind of nice. That version definitely gives you a little more control on where things drop because, as you'll notice, like, it can be very different, right, as to where things go. Now the dice is way over here. Okay, so, like, it's finicky. You don't really know what you're going to get with the dropping method, but it also definitely feels like people are paratrooping in, right? You really don't know where the wind's going to blow you. You don't really know what's going to happen, okay? But when we look at gliders, it's kind of the same as paratroopers, but a little bit different. So here is my glider. He's almost finished, almost ready for the tournament. It's a Thingiverse file. It's a super, simple free 3D print that I ended up picking up. Still getting the final base layers of painting on it, so it'll hopefully be ready. It is a glider, though, so I don't care quite as much about how great it looks because I'm not going to use it very often. But in this case, the glider, relatively simple. It should be about 12 inches long, which this one is about 12 inches, more or less. The wingspan, of course, is quite large on these guys. But they tell you more or less 12 inches by 3 inches is what you should use if you're not using a physical model for it. Which kind of makes sense, right? The fuselage is not particularly wide. And the way this is going to work is, again, when one of the units in the glider is activated, it receives its order dice, and it doesn't go down, and instead it's performing an advance or run action to enter onto the board, okay? Instead of coming in from their deployment zone edge, which is what it says, so you would have to, again, pass the order test in order to make it on, then you'll place the token. Now, strategy point number 1, and the reason why there are so many German dice out when we're starting to land gliders and airborne troops. My recommendation is if you have 9 units inside this glider, right, or however many you have in there, for the tournament that I'm going to, the transport capacity on the glider is 28, okay? But it's not technically stated anywhere in the book. If you're going to bring them on, have the first 6 of them go down. because the glider doesn't start coming on when the first unit in it is assigned an order dice. The trigger for placing the token and stuff like that is that instead of coming in from their deployment zone edge, so this would be a unit that is activated, that has been issued a run or advance order to enter the board and has passed its order test. Okay, again, Americans slightly more likely to pass this than anybody else running paratroopers. But if we end up assuming that we have put out, 6, 7 units or something like that, however many are going in there, I would leave about 2 or 3 that are in there that you don't put down. And the reason why is because the first guys that you activate, you want to make sure that in case they fail, you still have 1 or 2 more chances to pass the test to bring them on. If you're only bringing in veteran troops, then that's one thing. You probably wait until the last 2 or something like that. But I like to follow a rule of 3. Give yourself 3 chances to mess up on a 9 or lower. Okay. So in this case, we're going to activate. This is just a regular unit that's inside, and we're looking for a 9 or higher. Okay. In this case, that is a 10. I chose the wrong dice to do this with. That is a 10. And so because of the fact that that's a 10, that unit would go down. They wouldn't actually come on the table as reserves. So we would want a second try. Okay. Wow, I love it when the dice rolls actually do this. This is on a 7, so they would come in. Okay. And when that happens, you're going to do something similar in that you're going to take your order dice and you're going to place it, pointing the arrow in a specific direction. Opponent gets a chance to be able to adjust where that goes and where it's positioned. Now, in terms of thinking through the board and mechanically where I would want it to be, I definitely don't want to put it on this side because I've got an officer, admittedly with like 1 rifle, so it's not much, but still an officer nonetheless, and 2 squads, both with Hitler's Buzzsaw light machine guns. That is 10 shots from LMGs plus 2 rifles, all going to be shooting at the glider once it lands. And we'll explain why that's important in a little bit. But I'm looking at that saying, nope, that's a really bad idea. Okay, whereas over here, we're looking at 1 medium machine gun, right? You might be inviting mortar fire. Fair enough. You might have 1. I think this officer actually has an assault rifle. So depending on where he lands, we might be outside of 18 inches for his ambush. But the point being, you don't have nearly as much coming down. So I'm thinking big open area that's going to keep us from running into trouble. I'm going to place it somewhere over here. Okay. And so you would place it. I'm going to point it something like that or so. Yeah, maybe something like that. And then they have a chance to turn it 45 degrees or 45 degrees. They're going to turn it probably like this for various reasons. And actually, if I was smart, I would actually place it something more like this. So that way, 45 degrees will run me parallel with this thing, with this wall, but it's not going to actually hit the wall. That's important for later rules, okay? They could turn it so we're going in basically sideways, but then again, it's a pretty open shot. So we're just going to put that way. They are going to turn it sideways just to kind of make it go in an ideal direction. We roll our 2d6. And in this case, we would go 11 inches that way, okay? Now, the glider, because of the fact that it has its own basically slowing mechanism, its own parachute mechanism behind it to try to help slow it down, can basically emergency brake while it's in the air to try to slow itself down. And the way that this works is that you would then roll a dice and you would subtract that number of inches from the roll. So in this case, our 11 would be reduced down to 5. We would be removing 6 inches off of the roll. There are benefits and disadvantages to this, okay? The first advantage to this, obviously, is that you're coming in closer to where you chose, right? And that is helpful because if you run into anything with the glider when it's running, it's going to apply a penalty to the rolls of other people that are coming out of the glider. They're more shook up if they ran into something. The second, of course, is from a range and angle perspective. This is what 5 inches would be. That would land us nicely in the middle, but that machine gun team would have a good bit of the glider being blocked by the defensive fortifications, okay? Now, 11 would probably also still run us in the same position, so it's not going to make a dramatic difference. In this case, they're not going to choose to engine brake, okay? But the point is that you would have the, it might be advantageous in order to not trigger an ambush or to maintain that you're behind cover to potentially brake. the difficulty behind this is by just engaging the brake, every single unit when it tries to come out of the glider on the next turn is going to suffer a penalty to their roll to see whether or not they can exit the glider. Okay. Related to this, running into things is also bad. Okay, and this is where the trade-off comes in. It also applies a +1 modifier to that roll, which we will discuss presently. So I'm going to go ahead and place the glider. And then we're going to go ahead and start. Basically, we'll take a look at what's going on with the rest of the turn, and then moving on to how people get out of the glider, because this is where a lot of the thinking comes in. All right, so here's our glider. Glider has landed. It is, still relatively far away from the edge, and that was almost the maximum it could have gone. So again, we weren't too worried about it going off the edge. Even had it gone up and over and the wing was hanging over here, that wouldn't have been horrible because it wouldn't have physically hit. Okay, but the way that the test works is this: when a unit wants to exit the glider, and by the way, every unit is given a down order that's in the glider on the turn when it arrives. Okay, so they have to stay inside. Okay, the trick is gliders were able to be used in World War II because the armor was basically super thin. Right, it's not actually an armored plane. It is not designed to take any punishment whatsoever. It's just designed to be light. Easy in terms of the amount of fuel that the other plane, typically I believe a bomber, would need to use in order to carry it somewhere. It's reduced weight, but still enough structural support that it won't just like completely fall apart and destroy everyone inside when it lands. Okay, that's the bare minimum of what it's designed to do. But the way that this is represented in the game is that every unit's going to go down on the turn when it arrives. So you're not going to be able to use any of these units that are in here on turn 2. They're going to have to come in turn 3. And this is part of the reason why we want as many enemy units activated as possible before we bring the glider in. The second issue is because of its really light frame, it's counted as a soft skin vehicle, which means if any unit, including a pistol, rolls a successful 6 to wound against this thing, or an equivalent of a 6+ if they have a heavy weapon with a penetration modifier, the whole thing is destroyed, which means the units inside will get out of it, but they will suffer hits and potentially be completely removed in the wreckage, which is problematic. So that's problem number 1 for units coming in on a glider. Gliders are dangerous, okay? You need to be aware of this, okay? So problem number 1 is units could potentially be removed if this thing is shot to death. The second issue is that when they come out, you have to perform a check in order to see what happens to them. So on a 1 through 4, this is a 5, but if it's on a 1 through 4, nothing happens. They're able to get out, they're able to get disentangled, and they're able to exit the vehicle normally. Okay. Keep in mind, if they have pins on them because, say, a rifle dude shot at them, hit the plane but didn't wound it, or something else like that, they may still have to take an order test in order to then get out of, in order to get out of it. It doesn't say what the order of operations is. My assumption would be that you would roll the d6 for the glider exit first, because if they're stunned and can't get out, then there's no reason to roll an order test. They'd still be counted as down. They'd already get their order, and that's the end of it. So I think you would roll glider check to see if they get out first, order test to see if they successfully act on that instinct, and then go about your day. Okay? On a 5 or a 6, the unit would just be stunned. So basically, they don't exit the glider this turn. Because of the rules for gliders, that means you would have to assign them either a down order or a rally order, because they would be a unit that is not getting out of the transport, and so they would follow the normal rules for transports. So you could give them a down order, you could give them a rally order. Okay, there are technically advantages to both. Rally, of course, would be nice if you've already been shot at. If there are pins coming at you, you can get rid of those for next turn. Down is actually arguably more useful, because then at least if an HE blast hits you or something like that, you are down, so you would get half hits, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of how that works. Neither's good, but again, you do need to get a 5+. Keep in mind that 5+ drops to a 4+ if you had to engine brake and engage the parachute. So, minusing that d6 inches off of your move distance for the glider. And it would drop to potentially a 3+ if the glider still ran into a solid object, which could be a building, it could be a telephone pole. So, just those two being mentioned indicates to me trees probably count as a solid object. Walls probably count as a solid object. Obviously, vehicles would count as a solid object. Buildings and structures would count as one. I'm not sure about something like a trench. I'm just not sure. about how that works, so clarify that with your opponent. I also don't know if you had like a field, right? Like crop fields. I don't know that that would necessarily count as a solid object either, because push comes to shove, the stalks of wheat are probably going to bend to the plane. They're not going to stunt or break the plane, right, in any way. You're not going to feel it. You're not going to say, oh my goodness, that was a really harsh landing. We landed in a field of wheat, right? So, that's just a thing to think about. But the fact that it can go down to like a 3 potentially for stunning the crew is really, really bad. Okay, so in general, you definitely don't want to stack the two. You don't want to break and still hit something on the same turn. If you're going to hit something, you're pretty sure, don't even engine brake. Don't engage the parachute. Just hit the thing, stop there, and suffer the extra +1 to the roll. So that way, at least it's still on a 1 through 3, you're getting out. 4 through 6, you're say 4 and 5, you're now getting a stun result. Okay. But the important thing is that on a 7+, so you would need to get at least 1 modifier in order to have this happen. Not only does the crew go down and doesn't get out of the vehicle, they're so stunned, and somebody actually got severely hurt, and so one of the models is actually removed from the unit. Now, the good news is that model is picked by the controlling player. So, it's your glider. You do get to choose which model is removed from the squad, but you are now a man down, right? Having gotten in this deployment. So that's kind of how glider transporting works. It means that, again, when you're doing airborne combat jumps, when you're doing gliders, you're not going to be able to use any of these units until turn 3. So positioning is key. Where you place them is key. In what order your opponent activates things is key. So in this case, because all of the units that are in here are going down, we're not going to be able to get any of them out of the vehicle on the first turn. Now, there is an alternative way to deploy gliders. You don't have to do the whole braking thing and the whole, rolling dice to see how far you go. Similarly to the paratroopers, there is an alternative way to do it. And so I'm going to go ahead and explain how this works. Now, this one I think is actually really creative. I love how this one goes. And that is to kind of keep the theme of what we're doing, you make a paper airplane. So in this case, my daughter helped me make this, and she did a pretty good job of coloring the piece of paper before we made it into the airplane. And the way it's going to work is you're going to stand at the table, and you're going to turn away from the table, and you're going to walk 3 steps away. 1, 2, 3. Please forgive how messy my station is. My wife and I, our theater company, just finished up a play, and I'm still cleaning up the sets creation part of my basement. So you're going to just look at the table, right? You're going to aim, because as we all know, aiming is something you can totally do with paper airplanes. And then you're just going to throw the paper airplane, and where it lands is where it goes. If it lands off the table, it goes back into reserve and it tries to come in another time. But we're just going to aim. I'm aiming for that spot, more or less, okay, is where I'm trying to go for. And now let's see how it goes. Okay. So what would happen? This is bad, by the way, just so you know. This is like one of the worst situations you could have in this particular setup. We will replace the paper airplane with the glider. The glider has clearly hit a solid object, so that'll be a +1 to the difficulty for people to get out. So on a 1 through 3, they will end up being able to get out no problem. On a 4 or 5, they will be stunned, and on a 6, they lose somebody. They're still stunned and they lose somebody. But it's actually worse than that, because as you'll recall, this machine gun has an ambush order attached to him, which is currently underneath of the fuselage, so it's a little difficult to see. But he has an ambush order, which means as soon as you land, he can declare a fire action. And this would be done at point blank range. So 2s to hit. And if he gets a single 6, the whole thing is destroyed. The units start coming out, D6 pins for each one of them. Potentially this also triggers another ambush from this officer if he wants it. So what I would probably do if I was the German player, by the way, is I would actually activate his ambush first, which, because you'd be measuring to the fuselage, because it tells you it should be roughly a 12-inch by 3-inch sort of setup. Don't measure to the wing. I would recommend just measuring to the fuselage itself in the case of a real plane. That's just my personal recommendation. Because again, there's no guys in here, right? You shoot up the wing, it's not going to change anything. shoot at the fuselage. Okay, that's what I measured to. But in this case, he would shoot first. His goal is not actually to destroy the plane. His goal is to put a pin on everybody who's in the plane. That's his goal, right? Because again, it counts as a transport. So everyone inside will suffer pins equal to whatever the transport would suffer for its pins. And then after they're pinned by this guy, then you declare your ambush with this guy, and he shoots at the plane, attempts to blow it up. And then if he doesn't, he's still putting a second pin on everybody in there, which is fantastic value. Next turn, if you get the first snap, you just snap 2 with him. I don't think you can catch this machine gun, so you might consider just activating the machine gun. But you could always snap 2 and then, do all of your crazy stuff and put even more pins down here on people. That would be fine too, right? Like you have options. But ideally, you would destroy it. And then after it's destroyed, then, well, there you go. You're cooking with grease at that point. You're gonna have a lot of Americans in a very, very small area, very easily hit by something like, say, a multiple rocket launcher over there in the far corner. Let's see if I can actually. There it is. There it goes. Hey, thank you for focusing correctly. I think you even have direct line of sight with the multiple rocket launcher. You wouldn't even need to use a spotter. You might need to advance in order to turn it. Possibly, it might not be quite close enough. But that's horrifying. How many hits you could potentially get in a single spot. You have to be tricky to make sure you don't hit your own spotter and to make sure you don't hit your own machine gun team. But if a unit jumps out upon exploding from the fuselage and they're like somewhere over here, you might be okay. You might be all right. So just be careful about that. We do have several other airborne units that are still held in reserve, and they're going to parachute in, is the plan. Ideally, you would want some of these units that haven't activated yet to activate first. And if they go for something like, say, if the submachine gun unit were to go with an ambush order, so that way they could potentially get in a shot, you would just want to make sure that they're positioned wherever it is that you're going to land. You're either out of line of sight, so behind this big, tall wall without having anybody appear within the doorway where they can shoot at them. Or you're going to want them to be out of range. So, for example, if they were to deploy on this side, even if you could see them through this gap, if it's beyond 12 inches from the squad, then they can't hit them, right? You might also consider dropping them in so that way they're within the minimum range of an enemy unit. So I don't think it would be a particularly wise idea per se to try to land somebody right here in the middle, just because how are you going to make sure it lands right in the middle? But if you could line it up so that you could get it right there in the center of those, it's a big threat. And the ambush machine gun unit over here, assuming it hasn't shot at the glider, obviously, can't shoot at them because it's out of arc, right? So these are some things you're going to want to look for. You might also consider just doing force concentration, so kind of picking more or less the same spot and just dropping everybody pretty much in the same space. So that way, when you start breaking out, especially if you have an officer over there who can snap a bunch of guys, you can really take advantage of force concentration, and the first 1 or 2 squads that land probably eat through the ambushes, but everybody else is probably going to be fine. Okay. One last thing to talk about before we close. So looking at this side of the board, this is the far right-hand side of the board. Because of all the units over here with all the assault rifles, and we've got an ambush autocannon, an ambush double LMG squads, and an ambush officer, one might be tempted to think one shouldn't actually combat jump anybody into this territory. I'm not entirely sure that that's true, and here's the reason why. There are a couple of tricks by virtue of how the rules work for shooting that you could take advantage of when you're playing in a situation like this where they have a lot of units concentrated in one place. The first rule is the fact that you can't fire at an enemy unit if it comes within an inch of one of your friendly units. Too close, there's not a desire for friendly fire. So if I'm worried about these 2 LMG squads, for example, which, by the way, one should be concerned about double LMG squads on ambush, especially if you're planning on getting in close to them, okay? I could choose to position my thing in such a way that what I'm really aiming for is that my guy is going to deploy somewhere around here. And the reason for that is this squad over here has to measure from the closest model to the closest model. Even if we have like a 7-man squad going way up over here, and most of the squad is beyond that line of the Howling Cow, range is measured from closest model to closest model. And if it passes within an inch of this Howling Cow unit, which means it could even be as far as about here, they can't take this shot. because it's too close to the enemy. It's too close to a friendly unit. And so this unit would be safe from them. More than that, this unit over here, which would have a pretty good line of sight, would probably pass within an inch of this officer squad. And so because this officer is over here, these guys also might have problems with shooting. So effectively, these two guys wouldn't be denied a shot this turn on ambush against this squad. And this would be part of the reason why, as a defending player, you might consider putting them on ambush, but you might consider saving them and holding back their dice for a little bit longer. Maybe even go down with the Howling Cow, because what are the chances you're going to be able to get a lot of shots in a small area? On the second turn, save it for the third turn when you know everybody's getting out of the glider. Instead, you might consider leaving them on ambush so they can move and then shoot at people. Although, again, it also changes a bit of the dynamic in terms of how much of a threat you are as soon as people drop in. Okay, but that's definitely something to think about. But this is one of the shenanigan-y things you can do. Now, this doesn't save this unit. Again, the first two airborne units that go down are probably in trouble, because these guys are going to have absolutely no protection from the ambush autocannon tank. They're going to have no protection from these guys performing an advance action to drop back and then shooting with assault rifles. They might make it, and because it's an advance action, they could get into the water even and shoot, in which case they will definitely have range. So, again, you can't get past everything, but then again, maybe these guys falling back to shoot over there means that now you can combat jump a whole bunch of extra guys into this area, maybe try to land them in the forest, maybe try to land them, on this side of the trench, or even in the trench or something like that to set up for the following turn. Like, there are options because of the fact that you're now throwing a unit in a place that is smart, that denies some of the advantages of the enemy, and now forces them to redirect resources in a way that they were not quite ready to do, that then makes it a little safer in other areas. So there are ways to do this, okay? Again, it's a dangerous position. This is part of the reason why I don't think combat jump is that overrated. I think that it comes with legitimate trade-offs, and it requires a good bit of skill to place. But if you can pull it off, I think this could work out pretty well. So that is my overly long walkthrough on how to do combat jump and gliders. I think it's going to be fun. I don't think it's a meta way to play per se, although obviously if you're doing something like double envelopment or something like that, having a couple troops that drop in basically right on the board edge near the end of the round, and then the beginning of next round you snap them, you jump them, you get them off the board and stuff, maybe that is advantageous. An entire army doing combat jump and using gliders, I'm honestly not sure about, just because, again, like, so many units are in here. If this thing gets shot at all while a bunch of guys are in there, you could suffer a lot of casualties. You could lose potentially multiple order dice from a single enemy unit, right? That is, especially if it's something like a machine gun team, which is only going to be like a maximum of 50 points for the opponent because people don't take those veteran generally. But that's the basics behind how it works. Do you like this? Do you think that it is a fun way to work? Do you think that it's an overpowered means of deployment? I'll be honest, I'm fine with it. I think it's fun. I think it's stylistic. It's not nearly as powerful as other game systems when it comes to an Alpha Strike style drop, right behind enemy lines, because you do have to wait several turns in order to be able to use it. You're not really using the units that are involved with any of these for the first third of the game, and arguably possibly more than a third of the time limit. So because of that, I think there's trade-offs, and I like the fact that it has trade-offs. So if there's any changes you would recommend, or if you think that this is just overpowered and shouldn't be used, if you think that it should be part of the core rules and one of the benefits of taking airborne troops, let us know in the comments below, and I will see you next time.